she's obsessed with the fact that she worked in her time at the Bank of England and thinks that proves her credibility. So she lives in awe of the bank. She actually even worked for Andrew Bailey, who is the governor of the bank. So I suspect she still thinks of him as a boss in reality. She hasn't got the intellectual capacity, as far as I can see, about when looking at her economic discussions, to understand that we actually do need to have an integrated economic policy, which we haven't got. We've got an integrated mess. Well, sorry, we've got a disintegrated mess. This is insoluble until we have a bigger brain managing the economy. And so far, we've not been gifted with that by Labour. I was a chartered accountant for 42 years. I've been a serial entrepreneur. I co-founded the Tax Justice Network. I'm a political economist these days in reality, and I work as Professor of Accounting Practice at the University of Sheffield.
And so, just first off, the pound in the last week or so has slid to its lowest level in 14 months. Last week as well, the media were coming after the government for borrowing being at a 16-year high. Just for the average Joe Soap, what does that mean?
We're all doomed. That was what you could say, and that would be a completely absurd reaction because we're not all doomed. In 14 months, for heaven's sake, let's talk about something that really is happening at a serious scale here. Look, yeah, there is a fabricated crisis going on in the media about the fact that people have just realised that the Bank of England have been keeping interest rates in the UK far too high for far too long, and that the cost of that to the UK government is going to be quite serious, and that if we do not have a reaction from the UK government, including an instruction to the Bank of England to reduce interest rates, which they are perfectly allowed to do, then we will end up with austerity. And the reason why we'll end up with austerity is straightforward. If we look at Rachel Reeves' fiscal rule, she says that debt as a proportion of GDP is going to fall, but right now the interest cost paid by the government is higher in percentage terms than the inflation rate plus the level of growth. And therefore, if she's going to balance her books in the way that she claims she wants to, she has to make cuts in government spending to balance those books. She has no reason to balance those books. It's a completely spurious and unnecessary goal for government. But that's what she says she's going to do. So we could end up with cuts in public services for absolutely no reason. And that's what the furore is all about.
You mentioned there as well that the government are well within their means to be able to call on the Bank of England to act on these issues. Can you see that call coming at all in the next, 3 to 6 months or even sooner than that?
If I was Rachel Reeves, I would be using the power which is provided to her under Section 19 of the Bank of England Act 1998. I often think I'm the only person who's ever read that piece of law, but it does exist. You can go and look at it, and it does say that in an emergency, I would call this an emergency, the government is allowed to tell the Bank of England that it doesn't agree with its decisions and it can overrule them. And there are two decisions that the government could overrule now. One of those is the interest rate. We've got a base interest rate at present of 4.75% in the UK, which is near enough the rate of interest that is now being paid on government debt, which everybody is in a complete spin about. And if we look at the Eurozone, they're paying 3% equivalent interest. And the difference between the two is obviously stark, staggering, real, and providing a benefit to them, which we're not getting. And the government could say to them, cut the interest rate in the UK, the Bank of England, that is, cut the interest rate. But the thing that none of the commentators are also noticing, and this is the one that really staggers me, and I tried to raise this last week in a BBC interview, and I was cut off for actually mentioning it, and that is that right now, the Bank of England is selling £100 billion worth of bonds a year into financial markets. These were bonds that it acquired during the COVID crisis and during the 2008 financial crisis under the quantitative easing programs, and they're selling them back into financial markets. And the only thing that they're doing with that money is reducing the size of their balance sheet. It's cancelled. It's dead money. They're sucking money out of the private sector economy for two reasons. One, to keep interest rates high because they think they need to control inflation, even though inflation is under 3% and therefore of no great consequence at present. And secondly, to cut growth because they think that will reduce the rate of inflation. So we have Rachel Reeves getting terribly paranoid about the fact she can't deliver growth, and at the same time, the Bank of England going hell for leather and actually creating £100 billion of government bond sales a year to deny us growth. I mean, this is literally like driving with your left foot on the brake and your right foot on the accelerator, both as hard as possible, with the handbrake on as well. If you could achieve that and you still got one. My car doesn't seem to have a handbrake anymore. It's electronic. So I couldn't do that goal. But if you did, and what would you end up with? I can't remember what Jeremy Clarkson calls those spinning effects that he did in his time on runways. But the point was that we would just have the economy out of control. And that's exactly what we've got. This is actually and genuinely and fairly similar to the situation that was created when Liz Truss tried to do one thing with the economy and the Bank of England literally did everything it could to undermine her. And we got a crisis then. And to some extent, we have the same situation now. But the replication now is not that we've got an economic crisis, because we haven't got a real economic crisis. I mean, we've just got a bit of pressure on the pound, which is therefore falling to its, as you said, lowest in 14 months. But what we have got is a complete mismanagement of the economy going on, with the Bank of England and the Treasury making totally different demands and claims. And that's what is spooking people in reality. And it's what spooks me, to be blunt. The Bank of England needs to be reined in, brought under control, and generally told what to do, because they are the people who are really harming the UK right now.
Mhm. And you also mentioned in a blog post over the weekend that they're deliberately doing this. They're deliberately kind of putting the UK economy into overdrive, this conflict between politics and economy, and the issues that the Chancellor has to try and alleviate these problems that ultimately cannot be alleviated until she comes to the Bank of England and forces them to make changes. Why is it that there's this kind of conflict between the two? And I guess to touch on what you were just mentioning there, you said that this is different to how the economic meltdown of the Liz Truss days played out. But what is the tangible difference between the two, if there is kind of this conflict between the institution of the Bank of England and the institution of the Treasury?
The problem that we have with economic management in the UK can be simply summarised. We pretend that there is something called fiscal policy, which is about spending and, broadly speaking, taxation. And there's a thing called monetary policy, which is, broadly speaking, about setting interest rates and controlling the money supply. That is a fundamental error. It creates a perception that you can manage those two things independently when that is not possible. Remember, our money supply is created by the government when it spends, and it is withdrawn from circulation by taxation. Taxation does not actually fund the government spending. It can't, because there would be no money if it wasn't spent into circulation, first of all. So you can't fund with taxation because there is no money to pay taxation until the government has spent it into existence. Now, this is pretty commonly understood by economists. Some of them will jump up and down at this point and say, I'm talking about modern monetary theory and the magic money tree and everything else. If they can find an explanation as to how the money that is used to pay tax comes into existence without the money having been created in the first place by the Bank of England, and remember, if you look at all the money in your wallet, it's all got the name of the Bank of England on it, and you aren't allowed to create your own, then I'll be welcome to hear from them. But the reality is that these two things, taxation and money supply and the interest rate and so on, are all intimately related. And because we pretend we can split the two, what we don't get is a joined up policy. I mean, joined up policy was something that Tony Blair used to think about. I wish he didn't talk about anything anymore, but he does. And let's presume that on this occasion he actually got something right. We do need joined up policy. And what we haven't got is a joined up economic policy or economic management. So whilst we have the Treasury believing it can control one side of the equation and the Bank of England thinking it can control the other side of the equation, and the two working for fundamentally different goals, one for growth and one for the control of growth, which is what is happening. The Treasury is going for growth and the Bank of England is basically trying to stop growth. We will end up with those donuts that I explained. And that's the word I was looking at, which Jeremy Clarkson used to talk about when he was spinning cars on runways. Now, Is it likely that Rachel Reeves is going to change this? The answer to that is I don't think there's really very much chance at all that she's going to change that. I would she would, but she won't. Why? First of all, because she's obsessed with the fact that she worked in her time at the Bank of England and thinks that proves her credibility. So she lives in awe of the bank. She actually even worked for Andrew Bailey, who is the governor of the bank. So I suspect she still thinks of him as her boss in reality. And I don't think she knows how to control it. And I think we've got the wrong person in charge as a result. And secondly, she hasn't got the intellectual capacity, as far as I can see, about when looking at her economic discussions, to understand that we actually do need to have an integrated economic policy, which we haven't got. We've got an integrated mess. Well, sorry, we've got a disintegrated mess. Perhaps I should have put it there. And that's the consequence. I mean, this is insoluble until we have a bigger brain managing the economy. And so far, we've not been gifted with that by Labour.
I'll come back to that now in a second, but just on the disintegrated mess, one of the aspects of that the Labour government was keen to put out over the weekend was the 600 million pound investment by China into the UK economy. What would be the reason behind Rachel Reeves going to China seeking investment there rather than in markets closer to home or potentially traditional allies to the United Kingdom? Why go to China?
I'm completely baffled. I really don't know. I genuinely can't answer why she would choose to do that. It's just further indication of her political failure. First of all, she's likely to alienate Trump by doing this at this moment, and that therefore seems to be a particularly unwise thing to do right now. I don't think necessarily aligning ourselves with Trump is a great idea, but also putting ourselves in direct opposition to him doesn't seem a great idea either. And I'm pretty sure that Keir Starmer is trying to get high up on the list of people who are going to visit Trump soon after he comes into office. And I'm pretty sure Rachel Reeves hasn't helped his claim there. So that's going to make him look much less effective than Theresa May, who was number one in 2017. So really, really politically naive. Politically naive because obviously what is happening in China, particularly with regard to human rights, for which it was obvious that Rachel Reeves was having to apologise with throughout the statement that she made on this investment, but also naive because 600 million is, to use a technical term, the square root of diddly squat when it comes to foreign direct investment in the UK. I did a few numbers before we actually recorded this, and in comparison to total UK investment in infrastructure and all other assets, that's about 1/300,000th of total UK investment. So what is the fuss about? Now, obviously, it's more in terms of annual investment, but even then, we're still talking about thousandths. So what on earth is she doing this for? I genuinely don't know. The amount of money involved is in real terms tiny. China has no reason to invest in the UK economy in any significant way, and I'm sure it's not interested in doing so. It's not interested in investing anywhere where there are likely to be tariffs imposed by Trump, and we are highly likely to have tariffs imposed on us, just as China is also going to have tariffs imposed on it. There is just no logic to this at all. Why, therefore, did she flee off to China? And why did she take Andrew Bailey from the Bank of England with her? That was the question that I was most interested in. And I'm going to put out one of my sort of sometimes wacky and off the wall suggestions, which upset people, but which I think might reflect reality. And that is the Bank of England is really noticing the absence of Russian money in the UK economy at present, and it needs another source of hot money, and that other source of hot money is China. So Andrew Bailey was really there to encourage them to see the UK and its banks as the entry point for Chinese hot money into the European economy. Do I think that's plausible? Oh, yes, I do. I've spent too long looking at the way in which the Bank of England works to promote the flows of hot money through London to think that is implausible.
Mm.
I talk about looking at this subject. I've been doing this for well over 20 years.
Yeah, yeah. But of course, with that as well, in the plan itself, it is quite a diverse outline for such a, as you pointed out, relatively small amount of money. But by and large, the investment does seem to be in financial and legal services. Just when you blend that with this kind of plan for growth and the Labour government's objective of kind of making life easier and better for working people, and the kind of traditional Labour lines. How do these two things stack up against one another?
Look, Labour has abandoned its idea that it was involved in the traditional investment in hardcore manufacturing, making, delivering for the people of the UK. Financial and legal services is a euphemism for servicing the rich, servicing the interests of wealth, because they are the people who absorb those services. And I'm not disputing that there will be some jobs created for people in those activities potentially as a consequence of this investment. But again, the amount will be quite small. This is nothing to do with what Labour used to be. And I now look at Labour and think it's Lino, as I and friends call it, which is Labour in name only. Because if you look at what Labour used to be and what Labour now is, where we see Labour as the friend of finance and of financial services and of the city, which Rachel Reeves has described as the jewel in the crown of the UK economy, which is utterly bizarre. How can finance be the jewel in the crown of an economy when actually you can't eat or consume anything that finance produces? Then where is Labour in terms of its political philosophy? Clearly way out of line with meeting the needs of people in this country, in my opinion. And I say that as somebody who, let's be honest, worked in financial services, has studied financial services, and understands financial services. I've always understood that's a support service activity. It is not what people need to live on. And she doesn't seem to get that difference.
And just to continue on the line of China now for a second, the reputation, I guess, is one of the things that these kind of bilateral meetings often brings up in the discussion afterwards. Considering that, again, I repeat, such a trivial amount of money relative to what could be invested, what does it say about Britain's place on the world stage that kind of the Chancellor goes cap in hand to the Chinese and comes out with, I think it was 60 times less investment than economies like Hungary, for example, have gotten from the Chinese. What does it say about the reputation of the UK?
I think you actually summarized it in your question. You said, there we went, cap in hand. The begging bowl was open. It makes us look desperate, uncertain of where we are. We look as though we will take and do anything to survive. There's no principle behind anything in this relationship. Rachel Reeves described it as pragmatic. I would describe it as desperate. There is just nothing which reflects a policy here. And it also reflects something worse than that, though, and that is the economic bankruptcy of thought in the Treasury and thought, bluntly, in the Labour Party. And that is this lack of awareness that, in fact, the power to create 600 million is available to the government whenever it likes. It can just include that figure in a budget and raise it, and the city would fund it if that was the way to do it, or tax could be raised, or it could simply run a deficit with the Bank of England. And it would pay for itself if that money was invested appropriately by the government. But the idea which Keynes talked about in the 1930s, which you would have thought is what Labour should still be adhering to, that it is down to the government to get us out of an economic mess when we're in one, and we are, because the private sector is not delivering growth in this country, seems to be something that has been entirely forgotten by the Labour Party. They don't seem to know now that this is what actually they have to do to transform the economy. They don't realize it's down to them to create the money, to pump prime the markets, to give the resources that are necessary to get investment flowing again here. And if only they did understand that, they wouldn't need to be going around the rest of the world with their begging bowls out. They would actually realize that the capacity to transform our futures is available to them because they've got the power to make money sitting literally available to them. All they have to do is pass an act of parliament and instruct the Bank of England to create it.
And just finally there as well, this morning you had fresh attacks from business. It was the president of the CBI on Radio 4 talking about how market confidence is an all-time low, business confidence in the government is at an all-time low, and putting that down to things like rising national insurance and improving, strangely enough, improved employment rights were things that were damaging business confidence in the government. With those two things, do you think that Labour should renege on either of those policies in order to kind of appease business in any way?
I think that the national insurance increases were pretty unwise. I
Mm.
don't think they helped. I think that increasing the cost of employing people is the exact opposite of what I expected the Labour government that wanted to go for growth would do. I can't see how Rachel Reeves could renege on that with retaining any credibility. I think the questions that I've heard since this morning, or indeed on Radio 4 this morning and since, because there were a lot of questions posed to Keir Starmer at his press conference this morning, which said, are you going to sack Rachel Reeves? I think all those questions appear to be appropriate because I think she has already lost her way. I don't think he's going to get rid of her yet because he invested too much in her credibility before the election to suggest it's time for him to get rid of her right now. Do I see her making 2025 out? I'm not sure. Would I see her having a big difficulty surviving long into 2026? I just can't see her making it far into 2026. Do I think that there is a need for a change of strategy and policy? Yeah, absolutely, fundamentally. I just can't see Rachel Reeves as being able to do that. And I don't think Starmer is able to do it yet. But he is a ruthless man. Let's be blunt about it. The one thing we know about Starmer is he's pretty darn ruthless. He culled 250,000 members of the Labour Party to make it the party that he wanted. He got rid of all the Corbynites. There was a decidedly strong streak of willpower within him to do that. If he feels that Rachel Reeves is threatening his chances in 2029, by early 2026, I think she will be gone. I'm not sure who will replace her. I'm not sure that Labour has got anyone who really understands the situation well enough to replace her in the way that I think is necessary, because there doesn't appear to be that depth of intellectual thinking inside Labour that actually understands the whole issue literally as a big picture. Macroeconomics appears to be pretty much beyond most of their comprehension. They can understand microeconomics and the economics of the household, which is what, of course, Rachel Reeves played as being her strength when she talked about her mother balancing the budget on the kitchen table before the election. But those who actually can understand how you actually really manage a gross macroeconomy don't seem to exist in Labour at present, and that's pretty scary. But do we need a fundamental change of direction? Yes. Do I think the chair of the CBI was actually stating the truth? I'm not sure how old the chair of the CBI is these days, and I genuinely don't know. But I face the risk that I might be older than him. And I can tell you that I've been watching the CBI talking about the UK economy since the 1970s, which is kind of scary. And I did start young, I should add. I was very interested in the economy when I was a teenager. But even so, I will point out that there have been plenty of occasions when the CBI has been more worried about the UK economy than it is now. And I could reel off a long list of those occasions. So this is not the crisis of all crises, as he might have liked to represent. But we do need new thinking. We do need competent people. We do need someone to actually change the fundamental rules of the game. And the rules of the game, which were set by Ed Balls and Gordon Brown in 1997, when they made the Bank of England independent to appease the neoliberals, which appeared to work at first and since 2008 has led to, frankly, one disaster after another, flatlining economies, interest rates that are too high, and a massive upward shift of wealth in the UK economy, which is itself a burden on growth because the wealthy don't spend. Simple, straightforward statement of fact. They are wealthy because they don't spend their money. That's how they become wealthy, folks. And therefore, they are not injecting enough of their money back into the economy to stimulate further economic activity. All of those things need to be understood. None of them appear to be, and therefore we're in trouble.